Okay, so this is the part 2 of this lecture on two state systems. And one thing to notice that what we discussed in the part 1, all these ideas can be staged in higher dimensional, but it won't be so easy to visualize. So that is one point to note. And again it can even be staged again also to infinite dimensions, but again it won't be easy to visualize. So we will not use this kind of pictorial aid for those things, but we will rather use some other aid which will be easier to deal there. So now we will enter about some very specific examples of two level systems, which basically that means a system which can have only two basis states, or the Hilbert space dimension is 2. And again, as we said, that it depends on what you are measuring. So if you are measuring the spin of an electron, then it's a two-dimensional Hilbert space. If you are measuring the momentum of a or position of a electron, then it's an infinite dimensional vector space. So I will suggest you to read this particular text, which is this Feynman lecture section 8.3 in the volume 3, to have a nice discussion on this aspect. Okay. So now let's give you a bunch of examples of two level systems, famous two level systems. First example is of course the electron spin half in the Stern galaxy. So we studied that in great detail, I don't need to state it again. The other examples are like, for example, hydrogen plus molecules, which is like a two hydrogen atoms but one electron which is shared between these two, and it's a superposition of these two states where the electron is either in this associated with this atom or with this atom, like this nucleus or this other nucleus. The one famous example is ammonia molecule, which we will discuss in the context of this in this lecture at the part 3. And for ammonia molecule, to again to read that, I will suggest you to look up into the Feynman lectures for a great details about this ammonia, two states of ammonia molecule, which is basically, so ammonia molecule is NH3. So one state is that three hydrogens on a plane and the nitrogen is above the plane, forming some kind of a compressed tetrahedra. This compressed because these angles are not like a 120 degree, but they are rather instead 108 degree. So they are like a bit flattened tetrahedra. So that is basically the structure of a ammonia molecule, and there are two possible states as far as this orientation is concerned. It is the state where the nitrogen is above the plane or below the plane, and this is like the two state. And one can, of course, if I think about rotation in this direction, then there are infinitely many possible configurations. But if I consider rotation about, let's say, this axis, then we talk about these two particular states, and the main difference between these two particular states will become clear when you put it in some electric field. So a discussion about that will follow in the later part of this lecture. And there are other examples like the benzene ring. For example, we know the benzene ring can be, these double bonds can be either here and here and there, here, or here, here and here, and this is basically a superposition of these two states, and we represent it. So this picture represents that this is a superposition of these two. So another example is the famous double slit experiment, as we know, and you might surprise that, oh, we are measuring the position of a particle, not the spin, or not like any two component object, but actually you can think the double slit experiment as a two state experiment by saying whether the electron pass through this slit or this slit, and that is basically a superposition of these two slits. And then you can also add, in addition, add the momentum dependence or the position dependence, and there are formal way to do that is write it in terms of something called a direct product. So we will come to that discussion again, that how to explain a double slit experiment in terms of a two state system like picture. And there are some more fancy examples. For example, if there are neutral K meson oscillation, where like there are two states of K mesons, these are like examples of strange mesons. If you know the strange particle and strange quark and all those description, up, down and strange. So it's down quark and the strange quark, and K0 bar and K0 are the two K mesons, and the oscillation between these two states can be described again within the same framework. And the famous example, another famous example is this neutrino oscillation. So neutrinos again have these two mass eigenstates, and they can oscillate between these two. And as we are discussing informally, that this famous ice cube experiment and all those, though they try to detect this kind of neutrino oscillation. And so what I am trying to emphasize here, that all this wide range of experiments and wide range of physical phenomena, they can be all described by the same mathematical representation, which is this. And whatever we will learn about these systems from one of these experiments, one of these phenomena, we can tell what will happen in all these cases. So that is what is the main point I want to emphasize. And in order to fully internalize and fully realize that, we have to study at least two of these examples, and here I intend to do this and this in this lecture, and I urge you to, I will strongly recommend you to look up at the other examples from the book, from various other reference. And there are of course other very famous examples like this pseudo spin of graphene. So graphene has this Valley degree of freedom and spin degrees of freedom, and they are very cool potential applications for them in valleytronics and spintronics. That is also again tells you two completely different objects. They are not spin, but they are spin like. So sometimes we use the word spin or spin half to describe all these systems which are so wildly different. All these systems who are so wildly different, but we still call them spin because they form the same mathematical properties as that of a spin, same same structure and same kind of structure as far as quantum mechanical properties or quantum mechanical dynamics is concerned. We sometimes use the word spin to loosely talk about all these systems. And finally, I want to mention that one of the most hot example of our present time of this two state system is a qubit. So we know a bit, a computational bit is basically an on off state, 0 or 1. So it's either 0 and 1 and or 1, and we can represent all our logic gate and do all the electronics electronic device we used is basically designed based on this idea. But we will see that if this quantum mechanical bit, which is basically quantum superposition of 0 and 1, it can be both 0 and 1 at the same time. So that is how to manipulate that, how to form a logic gate in terms of that, and how to use that to do computation is one of the frontier problem of our time, and mostly in our lifetime this is the this will turn out to be the most important problem to design, scale and apply and try to understand. And that reason is following, that it gives this promise of performing some calculation or some process into these two channels, this 0 and 1 at the same time, because the system can be in both of these at the same time. That is not true in classical. If it is 0, it is not 1, it's 1, it is not 0. So basically you do a calculation in many worlds at the same time, and then you measure it by some superposition, and the output is some probabilistic output. So how do you solve a problem using this kind of a gate structure, using this kind of a logical bit? That is one of the frontier problem of our time. And so understanding this two state system is, that's why extremely important. And as I want to also remind you that in 2012 Nobel Prize was basically this Haroshe and all was basically for some experimental discoveries in the context of these two state quantum optical systems. Okay. So now to do this case study, let me first start with the simpler problem, or the rather I will say the familiar problem, because as far as simplicity is concerned, all these problems are roughly on the same footing. So the more familiar problem of a spin precision in a magnetic field, the problem of spin as we know. So to do that, I will go back a little bit on something which you must have learned in quantum mechanics in the previous course of quantum mechanics, but I want to revisit that. And this was already, we used this idea when we discussed the Stern-Gerlach experiment, but I want to nevertheless once more repeat that. So the idea is following, that how does this spin angular momentum spin comes into picture in quantum mechanics? Why do we care about such a thing at all, and how is it different from the usual angular momentum? So as we know, a angular momentum is defined as a r cross p, and r is the position, p is the momentum, and if a particle is moving in a circle, it has a certain angular momentum. And for example, the rotation of earth has two types of angular momentum. One is because of its axial rotation around its own axis, which is represented by I omega, where I is the moment of inertia and omega is the angular velocity, and another is because of this orbital rotation around the sun. So these are both examples of angular momentum. But spin angular momentum is a peculiar type of angular momentum, because it holds the property of an angular momentum, but it is not like this object L, which can be written as some kind of a r cross p. It cannot be broken down as r as some r and p. So then you such that you can think it as some rotation is associated with it. There is no rotation is associated with it. At least one cannot visualize any rotation like thing in classical, like one do in classical mechanics, but still it produces an angular momentum. So it's very peculiar in that sense. So let's try to see what is the problem here, to think it as a angular momentum like we know traditionally. So let's see, consider a particle, a charged particle which is moving in a circle of radius r at a velocity v. It has a mass m and charge q. So if it does that, it will generate a magnetic moment. That is what we learned from our electrodynamics course. You can revise this from the chapter 5 of Griffiths, and that magnetic moment is proportional to is I times A, the I is the current, times the area vector divided by C in the CGS unit. And what is this I? This I is the current, that is the charge passed in the unit time, where the time t is the time period of it going around this, that is given by 2 pi r by the velocity, the periphery times the velocity of the electron. And let us say the velocity is some property of the electron depending on how you set it into motion, and then A is pi r square. So basically this quantity is q v r by 2 c, and that is nothing but 2. So if I write it properly, it is basically mu is q by 2 m c times L, the orbital angular momentum. So a rotating charge, a rotating charge around some axis always generates an angular momentum. So can we think about electron as a object like that? So this is something we know already from electrodynamics. I didn't go over the details. And Griffiths chapter 2, you will see this a rotating loop of current, how it produces an angular momentum mu. A magnetic moment of mu. So this magnetic, you can think it as a magnetic dipole moment. To create a electric dipole moment, you need a plus minus E charge, but to create a magnetic dipole moment, you need a rotating charge in a loop. So this magnetic dipole moment. So let's say, so now what happens when you do this measurement on this various quantum mechanical particle? So that suggests this to be some g times q by 2 m c times some angular momentum s. So that is what the experiment suggests, and this g factor is 2. This is called the g factor, and this is 2 for electron, 5.58 for proton, minus 3.2 for neutron. So how can I understand this object from can we try to understand this this kind of magnetic moment an electron generates from the picture of a rotating charge? So if we try to model it as a electron as a sphere, so the sphere has radius r and it has a charge q uniformly distributed on its surface, and I try to compute this object, this mu equal to 5 q by m c, I will get this result. Okay. And this result tells you, oh, maybe it is the something we want with the g factor of 5 by 2, but our g factor is 2. Then you might think, oh, if I change the shape a little bit, like then maybe I can get this g factor of 2. So it will be a rotating object, but not a sphere. But if we try to do that, what is the problem? So what is the problem is there is a little bit of historical fact that what happens when you try to do that, and that historical fact was discovered first by 2 graduate students, Dutch graduate student called Goodsmith and Uhlenbeck in 1925. So they realized that to analyze the optical spectra of certain alkali atom such as sodium and all, so you need to assume that electron has this additional degrees of freedom which are 2 component. So they expected a transition line between 2 energy level from the from the traditional quantum mechanical theory, that it to be of some frequency, but instead they observed 2 lines. So the only way to understand is by assuming these lines are not single line but double line. So these 2 levels, there are 2 energy levels, and that is associated with some 2 component or 2 dimensional Hilbert space. So there must be some 2 dimensional Hilbert space associated with the alkali atom of or the electron of this kind, because they have only this outer shell s electron, and that that object is must be some. So how do I think of such a object connecting to electron? We can think of the position, but if we try to think of the this rotational degrees of freedom, so then they first assume that one can think it as some spinning object. That's why the historical name of spin came into that. So, there is no good reason to call it a spin actually, but only the fact that you historically somebody tried to visualize it as a rotating object. So, then they got this result and reported it to advisor Ehrenfest, and who wrote it to the famous physicist of that time, Lorentz, and Lorentz did the calculation for this rotating sphere model, and realized that to produce the amount of angular momentum they are talking about, the sphere has to rotate at a speed such that the speed of the at the equator is 10 times the speed of light. So, then he reported saying it is violating relativity. So, he reported back that to Ehrenfest. Ehrenfest communicated that to them. So, then they thought must be this thing is wrong, this whole picture is wrong. But Ehrenfest nevertheless published this result in their name, saying that okay, even if it is wrong, it is not a big deal, because he made this famous statement that you are young enough to be able to afford a stupidity. So, that means like you are so young, so even if you are wrong, it is not a big deal. If you are right, it is all good, because and it will be celebrated because you are very young for this, but even if you are wrong, it is not a big miss, and that idea turned out to be right. So, it turned out that you need this 2 level or 2 dimensional Hilbert space and extra degree of freedom of electron as far as these certain experiments are concerned, and that object, when you try to associate with a rotating object or spin, you run into this kind of difficulty. So, the best you can say that an electron somehow produces a magnetic moment which is associated with some kind of a spin angular momentum, and this word somehow generates that. How it generates that is not clear, nobody knows how it does that, and it rather there are some other explanations, a little bit better explanations for it from when you learn quantum field theory and all those subjects, but there is no classical underlying picture on it. It is an entirely quantum mechanical phenomena, that how a small object like electron, so almost like a point particle, generate that much of angular momentum. There is no good explanation for that, no underlying classical explanation for that. So, that is the origin of spin. So, now let us discuss about the SG experiment context, that how the mathematical formalism. So, let us say I have I know learned these things already, that if I measure spin z on a arbitrary state, you get only 2 possible values, which is plus half and minus half, plus half h bar and minus half h bar, and that you represent in terms of this eigenvalue equation by saying this plus minus z are the eigengates of SG, and then you can work out the form of this SG operator by noting down what we learned in lecture 5, that an arbitrary operator can be written like this in some particular basis, and if this A prime and A are the eigenbasis of A, then it is a diagonal form. So, based on that, so let me express this, do the same thing for SG. So, when I do that using this resolution of identity twice, I get this form, and since I know that this Z is the eigengate of this, so this is a diagonal form, and this turns out to be this. So, if I want to write it in a matrix form, I have to give some matrix structure to plus Z and minus Z, and we earlier have chosen that to be, for simplicity, we have chosen that to be 1 0 0 1. So, then the SG takes this particular diagonal form, and again we know that these choices are completely arbitrary. We could have chosen something arbitrary, any two orthogonal states would have been fine, but that could have made the SG some complicated object. So, that is for simplicity we just choose this. So, now how will I discuss a Hamiltonian in this picture? So, now we want to discuss the description of a 2 level system and describe what kind of Hamiltonian represents it, and how to discuss its time, how to describe its time evolution or predict the outcome of a particular measurement. So, in order to do that, let me write down the Hamiltonian of a generic magnetic moment. So, we have earlier discussed that whenever how do I know the Hamiltonian of a particular system? The point and there is no systematic way, a very well defined systematic way to do that in quantum mechanics. So, what we do in most of the cases in practice, because we establish this correspondence between quantum mechanical equations and classical mechanical equations, and we realize that the closest object to to any classical mechanical object. The classical mechanical objects are basically position, momentum, and all these classical variables, and the closest quantum mechanical object to that are basically operators and their expectation values. So that is what they represent. So we describe this prescription that whenever we have a classical Hamiltonian, we take these objects and promote it to be an operators and make them operators, and that way we get the quantum Hamiltonian, and from there we proceed, and from there we proceed to describe the evaluation of state and all that. So we learned this from the Ehrenfest principle and all these earlier lectures on the Heisenberg picture of describing dynamical time evolution and all that. So now we will use that to describe the Hamiltonian of a spin in a magnetic field. So what is the classical Hamiltonian? The classical Hamiltonian is mu dot b, where b is the magnetic field. So these are the vectors, and mu is the is the magnetic moment generated by an electron spin. So that I write it down in terms of spin, it becomes some prefactor times h dot b. Now, as some of you asked that why I am not considering the momentum, the kinetic term in the Hamiltonian. So ideally, a electron has momentum and spin both. So they must, when put in a magnetic field, they must have both. And actually, true, they should have both. So the formal way to write it is calling it like p square by 2, which is an infinite dimensional matrix. You know that, times I2, which is a 2-dimensional eigengate for this spin, plus this object, which is this I times this I infinity or identity infinity times this mu dot b, this 2-dimensional vector. So that is a formal way to represent this kind of a full Hamiltonian matrix in Hilbert's in proper way. And so the state and eigengate of this will have these two levels, because these two parts actually don't commute with each other. So that you can show by simply taking the kinetic part and the potential. You can show that because there is nothing correspond to that. So this is the, let me call it T and the B. So the T operator and the B operator, sorry, I meant to say they commute with each other. So that means you can have a level of this, you can describe a state using the eigenvalue levels of these two operators. So let me call it the P level and the sigma level. So a state of this H will have this P sigma, which is 2 times infinity dimension. That is, these are 2 times infinity dimensional times 2 times infinity dimension matrix, and that is the description of that. And for a full description of this, that is what you have to use actually. But here you are taking away the P part. You are taking away the P part by saying, oh, I will only talk about the spin block. So you can, if I write this thing in a matrix form, I can either write it as like 2 by 2 blocks of infinite dimension. So these are the 2-dimensional objects, and this is the infinite dimensional thing. That is the meaning of a direct product. If you don't know the formal meaning of direct product, I will we can wait a little bit and we will discuss it later in this course. Or we can write it as like one infinite dimensional block and another infinite dimensional block in this form. So this is the momentum block, these are the momentum blocks, and these two are the spin blocks. And the eigengate is basically then P times sigma. So that is the most appropriate way to write it. And this is why we are not talking about the kinetic term yet. We are only talking about the potential term. So assuming that either the kinetic term is 0, or we can assume that the kinetic term is separable. So we can just talk about this segment of the Hamiltonian and call it also, I can call it H, but I can, if you want a better name, I can call it the HS and this like HP something. So let's call it HS, so to make it clear. So now I write this classical Hamiltonian and write it fully, and now consider a B of the magnetic field which is pointing entirely in the Z direction and nowhere else. And notice that in this experiment, it is important that this B magnetic field is like is not uniform in space. If it is uniform in space, then the force due to this potential will be del dot T. Since this is not space dependent, neither this space dependent, this will be 0. So then there will be no force, and then there will be no deflection of the plus and minus in two different directions. So to do the Stern-Gerlach experiment, you actually need a non-uniform magnetic field. That's why the Stern-Gerlach magnets are wedge shaped. If they are like this flat shape, then you won't get this separation. But here we are not entering into that Stern-Gerlach description. We are just saying, let's say it is just some constant. We can also take it, make it non-constant. That will not change much of the discussion following here. Okay. So now I have this B to B0. So now my Hamiltonian is some number times SG B0, and the quantum mechanical Hamiltonian then would be promoting these operators, this operator to a promoting these variables to an operator. So this operator is the spin operator. So H is represented by this. So now I can make a shorthand, which is like right. Okay, I will not take this shorthand now. I will use this shorthand later. Okay. So now notice that this H and Sz commute with each other. Why? Because the H has a Sz inside it times some number constant, and this is Sz is the operator. So this H Sj minus Sj H is obviously 0. That means it's commute. So that means they must have simultaneous eigengate. That we learned already. The commuting operators are simultaneous eigengates. So that means the Z Sg operator eigengates plus Z and minus Z are also eigengates of this H operator. So now if I apply the H operator, which is nothing but the Sg, I will get this plus H bar by 2 and minus H bar by 2 eigengates. So that way I know the eigen equations or the eigenvalue equations of the Hamiltonian operator. So I can now introduce a shorthand. I call it E plus and this guy E minus. So this E plus is this and E minus is this. There is a minus sign. So this E plus I can now introduce another shorthand and call it omega naught by 2, where omega naught is this entire factor, and that is why I call it omega naught. Is some historic reason, it's the Bohr frequency. So this is also the omega naught. So this is I call it like that, and this is my E plus and E minus. So now my Hamiltonian equation in this shorthand notation is just this. So from there I can work out just the way I worked out the Sz operators. Since they are both commuting with each other and they have this structure, the H operator is also diagonal. So that's E plus E minus, that is the structure of the H operator. So now if I look at the dynamics, now that I know the H operator, I know the generator of the dynamics or time evolution, I can say everything about the time evolution. It's a simple diagonal equation. So my time evolution operator will have now this form, which is basically, if I plug in the H, it is basically omega naught Sg t, and I can write it as some phi Sg. So phi is some angle, which I combine these two guys and write it as phi. And as you can see that it is equivalent to applying a rotation operator. So if you know, when you learn rotation, so you don't know yet details about rotation, so you may not fully understand it. So rotation by angle phi is generated by an angular momentum Sz. So that is the generator of rotation. So that is equivalent to saying I am rotating this object around this axis, where this is the axis Z axis. So that's why you have this Sg, and this is equivalent to a rotation, and this is like a precision. So it's a precision of this point around this axis. So that is what the dynamics does. If you are your Hamiltonian is commuting with the operator Sg, and your system is one of these states plus Z and minus C, and their time dependence will be nothing but a precision. Okay, so now I can write this ut act this thing on the plus Z, and I will find that this Sg, I can expand it again this exponential and get this form. So basically the Z remains to Z with only the addition of some p factor. So that is the dynamics. It's pretty simple because we know the eigenstates. We already learned this, that the eigenstates don't change under dynamics. The only thing it does, it picks up a time dependent phase factor. It's only the non eigenstates which does some complex things, because so now to see that, let's look at this much more explicitly. So let me take my initial state as some non eigen. So in this case I took the initial state as some eigenstate of the Hamiltonian, and now I take my initial state to be non eigenstate of the Hamiltonian, some other state of the which is not a eigenstate of the Hamiltonian. So if I apply my e to the power I h t on that, I will get this. So each of the eigengates will be stationary. So this was stationary, but the superposition is not necessarily the same, because these phase factors will vary depending on time. So this state will also vary. So this will keep changing depending on time. So now if I plug in my omega naught definition, it will be nothing like this, nothing but like this. And as I know that I can take out an arbitrary phase factor, and that will change nothing about this state. So I took out this arbitrary phase factor omega naught t, and the relative phase became this e to the power I omega naught t. So that tells me completely what is this psi t and how it evolves with time, how it changes with time. So now I want to calculate some arbitrary probabilities to see that what these probabilities will be. So if after a time evolution, after some time I measure the plus z. So after some time evolution under this, so I choose a plus x state, and I put it under some uniform magnetic field B naught z cap, and I let it pass for time t under this, and then I measure n s z. So that is the meaning of this. I will get a plus z and minus z with probability half. So that is what I get from this expression, and that means if I calculate the expectation value of SZ, since the eigenvalues are plus h bar by 2 and minus h bar by 2, the expectation value will be 0. So that means that this expectation value is like a constant of motion. That is what we expected, because we know this earlier, that if we are in eigenstate of a particular operator, so under time evolution that eigenstate does not change and that operator becomes a constant in motion. That we learned from Heisenberg equations. So to see that, again I plug in, I go back to the Heisenberg equation, take the expectation value, which is the Ehrenfest equation, and notice that this result is also, we can get it from there by noticing that this guy is 0, and that means this Sz is some constant. I do not get that Sz is 0, but I get the Sz is at least constant, it is not changing with time. So that is like a constant of motion. Now I can do the similar calculation, that I can ask the question, what if instead of measuring a z, if I measure the SZX, what if I measure this? So now this thing will be dependent on time, because now because this operator, this Hamiltonian operator, projected this system in one of the z eigengates, and that is why when you measure the superposition of z, you get plus up and minus up irrespective of the time. But this, when if you measure x, then you get, of course, then it will depend that when are you measuring it, because as a x eigengate, this thing is not the same thing, because this superposition is changing with time. So now you can intuitively expect that this whatever you get after the x measurement will depend on time, whereas for z it will not depend on time. So now let us check this intuition by projecting it on plus x. So if I do this calculation, I get cos omega naught t by 2. So the probability is cos square omega naught t by 2, and minus x is sin square omega naught t by 2, just 2 lines of calculation. So that tells me that intuition is verified here. So if I do the Sx is, of course, so another way of seeing that is to notice that Sx is not a constant of motion. So that is why when you compute the Sx average, you get this, you put these probabilities, you get h bar by 2 cos omega naught t. So and if you compute the Sx again in another defined way, which is like using the Sz basis by putting this psi instead of doing this direct probability calculation, you again get the same result. This is just doing the same thing in 2 different ways. Similarly, if you do it for the y, since y and x are 2 perpendicular directions, so they are not, and neither of both of them are perpendicular to z, you also expect there is to be this thing will be time dependent, and this calculation will tell you this is the time dependence, and again the sy average can be obtained from here to be sin omega naught t times h bar by 2. So these are very simple calculations, and the calculations are although the calculations are super simple, it is important that you can tell the outcome physically without doing the calculation, at least tell that whether it will be time dependent or not, and that comes from very obviously by various arguments. One, by noticing that this is not a constant of motion, and secondly by noticing that as a x eigenstate with the time dependence, this is changing continuously, but the z eigenstates themselves are not changing, they are just getting a phase factor. That is why the z measurements does nothing, but the x and y measurement gets a time dependent factor. Okay, now let us try to understand all these results again from the Ehrenfest dynamics. The Ehrenfest dynamics for the Sx operator is this, and the Sy operator is this, and the Sz operator is this. So this thing is trivially 0, so Sc is a constant, but in this if I plug in these two Sy and we know this commutator relation for Sx and Sx, which you can cross check, and you have also done it in some assignment, so you know this commutator. So, if I plug in this, I will get this. So, my dsx is this and sy is this. So, now if I put these solutions here, they satisfy this, or if I solve this two equation, I will get this thing. So, that tells me completely that how you can get the same result of Sx, Sy and Sz using the both pictures of Heisenberg and Schrodinger dynamics. Now, based on all this, let me give a classical picture of what is happening, and that is again corresponds to the same thing as the quantum. What you get from this quantum expectation values are supposed to behave like classical variables, and you already know that if I have a spin, some arbitrary spin, and if I or angular moment or magnetic moment, and if I look at their dynamics in the in a magnetic field in z direction, you will see the x component and y components are precessing and the z component is fixed. So, that you know classically, and that you also get from this quantum mechanical calculation by these two sets of by these three sets of results. So, these things will continue to precess the x y plane, and this will remain constant. Okay. So, now there is one more point to discuss before I move on to the next topic of general description, is that the point was that we realized that an arbitrary state psi of a two component spin can be represented as this half angle, which tells you like c theta by 2 plus z plus e to the power I phi s theta by 2 minus c, or like to be more generic, let me call it 0 and let me call this 1. So, how, and this tells me that this phase returns to itself by a 720 degree rotation and not by a 360 degree rotation. That is the property, special property of spin half objects. So, there is a nice interferometry experiment, a setup which is given in some papers in 73, 75, where this was done, and I will put up this as reference. So, what was done? So, the details of this experiment require a little bit of more understanding of things like Bragg reflection and crystal phase and all that, but I can tell you just very crudely what it does. So, it takes these two path of electrons, and put one of this path under some magnetic field whose width, constant magnetic field of width L. Now, because of putting it some constant magnetic field of width L, so it spends a certain amount of time in this magnetic field, which is proportional to the size of these magnets, how long, how much time it spends. So, it picks up a phase like this, and now this phase you can put this, you can look at the interference, you can interfere these two beams, and then you can show that after what kind of phase this thing. So, this phi and this phi are not the same thing. So, in case it causes some confusion, let me call it alpha. So, that phase is very precisely this, and this tells you by tuning the magnetic field, that is something you can usually tune, you can check this, what is this phase, what this phase is. And so, this experiment tells you that by tuning the magnetic field, when you can go to like theta equal to 2 pi, theta equal to 4 pi and all that, and then you can show this thing gives you a constructive interference when theta is 4 pi and destructive at 2 pi. That tells you a very direct demonstration of how a spin half state precesses under magnetic field. And this experiment you can look it up again, the details of the experiment in the reference. That is something I wanted you to know. Okay. Now, as a homework, I want you to do these two problems, where you take the initial test state to be plus z and take the magnetic field to be in the x direction and repeat the analysis above, and I expect you to reproduce this analysis, which is just a different or alternation and just to alteration of what we just discussed, and this different analysis will help hopefully give you an insight of how these calculations are done. Now, there are two more interesting things I want to discuss, which I will discuss in the part 3 of this lecture, but right now we will go on to talk about the generalization of all we just discussed in a more concrete mathematical framework. Okay. So, here is the generalization. Now, we will discuss a framework to generalize everything we have learned about these two state systems from a pure from without discussing that what kind of physical systems it represent, but rather from the point of view at that what is the most general thing we can mathematically what is the most general thing we can do to describe any physicals any two state systems, and whatever two state systems will come in on our way, all this example of neutrino to graphene to spin half and ammonia molecule will be special cases of this generalized framework. So, one thing we realize that as a general property in this two state system which has these two eigenkets, and that can be represented as 1 0 or 0 1 for our convenience or sake of simplicity, but equivalently any two orthogonal vectors are good enough. Like if this 1 by root 1 by root 2, this could be 1 by root 2, like let us say 1 by root 2 minus 1 by root 2, and similar if this is 0 1 it could, these are all equivalent, there are infinitely many choices, and for simplicity I will just choose this for the follow up discussion. Now, let me describe an arbitrary Hamiltonian operator in this space. So, let us say arbitrary operator. So, let us say so we know that the only criteria is that the operator has to be Hermitian. So, that puts a constant that A dagger is must be equal to A, and let me try to describe a Hermitian operator like that. So, now let us say it is a complex operator, a complex 2 by 2 matrix which acts on these 2 dimensional vectors. So, then it must have 8 parameters. So, let me call it these are the 8 parameters, and since it is Hermitian, its diagonals has to be real. So, that immediately reduces. So, the Hermitian criteria immediately reduces the number of parameters to 6 to 4, because this guy has to be conjugate of this guy and these two has to be real. So, that makes me gives me 4 parameter. So, let me represent this 4 parameter. Let me call this Z2 as A1 plus IA2. So, this must be A1 minus IA2, and this Z1 and Z3 are 2 parameters which I can just writing them as like some alpha 1 alpha 3 some real number, and represent it as A0 plus A3 A0 minus A3. So, there is an advantage of writing it in this way, which we will see it in a moment. So, now my A operator is the most general parametric form is this A1 plus IA2, and any arbitrary numbers will represent them, it does not matter what is that A0 minus A3. So, that is all. So, now this can be written in this form, okay, which is A0 identity A1 sigma 1, A2 sigma 2, A3 sigma 3, where identity is 0 1 1 0, sigma 1 is the Pauli matrix, first Pauli matrix, sigma 2 is the second Pauli matrix, sigma 3 is the third Pauli matrix. So, this is to say that any Hermitian operator can be written in terms of these 4 Pauli matrices. So, that is to say this identity and this sigma. So, they are called together the sigma matrices, they form a basis, but this basis is not orthonormal because these things are not orthogonal to each other. So, this is not an orthonormal basis, but it tells you an arbitrary matrix, Hermitian matrix, 2 by 2 Hermitian matrix can be represented in terms of this Pauli basis, in this Pauli basis. Okay. So, now let us now that we established that this Pauli matrices are so important, because now you can talk in terms of the Pauli matrix as a parameterization and 4 scalar quantities A1 A2 A3. So, this is generally written in this form A0 plus A dot sigma. So, as if this sigma is like a some abstract vector sigma I cap, sigma I cap, sigma 2 j cap plus sigma 3 k cap, and this A is like A1 I cap plus A2 j cap plus A3 k cap. So, some real vector. So, you write it in terms of that as if you are multiplying these 2 vectors and a scalar which is A0 times identity. Okay. So, now let us look at, and alternatively you can call it a 4 vector also and just write, say this is some A dot sigma where these are like 4 dimensional vectors. Okay. So, now this Pauli matrices has some properties which are very important to describe the generalized properties of this kind of operators. So, a Pauli matrix is a square root, a square is always identity, which means we know from this we earlier discussed that if this polynomial equation is satisfied, this is called this characteristic equation. So, if the equation is this, then it can have only 2 eigenvalues, which is +1 and -1. So, for any arbitrary alpha these 2 can have only 2 eigenvalues. So that explains that. Okay, we will come back to that, this plus minus 1 structure, but that tells me why any arbitrary operator can have only two by measurement can only give two numbers, and that is why they are called like two state systems. So also we know they have vanishing stress and of these operators, and moreover we know they most importantly that they satisfy this commutation relation. The sigma j sigma k is 2 I epsilon j k l sigma l, where epsilon j k l is the Levi-Civita symbol. That means if I write this j k l in a cyclic in this counterclockwise way, so this is positive, it is anti-clockwise, then it is negative. So if it is 1 2 and this is 3, so it is 1 2 3, that is 1 2 and 3 in terms of increasing numbers. So this is positive, so 2 I sigma 3. But if I say sigma 2 1, so it becomes 2 1 and 3. So that means I have to go this way, which is clockwise, then it picks up a minus sign, and this is minus 2 I sigma 3. So that is how to describe it. And then there are two more useful operators, which are basically linear combination of these first and second Pauli matrices. So they are non-Hermitian. Of course, they are non-Hermitian, but they are useful combination, and we will see that they are how we can describe this two component spin system in terms of this. So the sigma 3 is like, now to notice that this sigma 3 is commuting, anti-commuting is commuting with this sigma plus minus 1 with this relation, and sigma plus and sigma minus are themselves commuting to give a their commutator is giving sigma 3. So that is this property, and also notice this sigma I sigma j anti-commute to identity. Anti-commute means this commutator is sigma I sigma j minus sigma j sigma I, anti-commutator is sigma I sigma j plus sigma j sigma I. So these things, all these properties will turn out to be very useful and also associated with various physical things, but here I am just giving a mathematical structure. So as I repeat this statement, that any operator, any arbitrary Hermitian operator in this 2D Hilbert space can be expressed in this A dot sigma form, which is this, and this is alternatively also it can be expressed in terms of these non-Hermitian combinations, which we will see they will form this idea called ladder operator, and they can be expressed also in this form alternatively. Okay. So now we have this description and formalism out of the way. So let us try to understand some mathematical properties and some general properties of this kind of two state system. Now notice this eigenstate, as we notice that any of this sigma 3 or sigma 2, they are basically has these two eigenvalues, which is plus 1 and minus 1. So let me say the sigma 3, the 0 and 1 are eigenvectors of plus 1 and of sigma 3. So this is 0 is 0 and 1 is minus 1. Okay. So now since they commute, since they do not commute, the sigma 3 does not commute with any other of the operators. So this is not a eigenkette of any of the other operators. So to know the eigenkettes of the other operators, we have to take a linear combination of this. Okay. So let us say the now if I know the eigenkettes of the sigma 3, the we know the eigenkettes of the sigma 1 and sigma 2 to be some linear combination, which is 0 plus minus 1 by root 2, and sigma 2 is again 0 plus minus I by root 2. Now again you have seen these kind of things before. These are basically this 1 by root 2, 1 by root 2 for this sigma x, and sigma 2 is basically 1 by root 2 I by root 2. So this basically reminds you of that, and all these properties can be obtained purely mathematically without subscribing to this physical intuition. So we learned all these things already once physically, now we are doing it very blunt and mathematically. Okay. Now notice we want to know that what is the unitary transformation. So now that this sigma 3 and sigma 1 are non-commuting operator, we expect that there must be a transformation which rotates the eigenbasis of sigma 3 to that of sigma 1, that we can construct by the eigenvectors of this sigma 3, and that will be basically become like that. So I want you to check these things, this basis transformation. So ask the question, if it does it diagonalize sigma 1, which means if I do take this u dagger sigma 1 u, is it diagonal, and ask the same question, what is does to sigma 3. So convince yourself that how this basis transformation works and how it takes you from one basis to another, and again do the same routine with sigma 2. These are basically some tiny things which I want you to play with, just to get very used to in the language of sigma operators, because later I will just use this very quickly and describe everything in terms of this sigma, this mathematical structures, and these things are very easy to check, calculate, understand and internalize, because they are all 2 by 2 matrices. Okay, now I will introduce another important concept called function of matrices, and this concept is very useful because eventually we will do this kind of when you compute, for example, the time evolution or generator of any kind of rotation or any kind of transformation. It has this form of e to the power I sigma dot a, like I h t, for example. So t is some parameter and h is again some matrix, and so you have to understand how to deal with this kind of function of matrices, the mathematical meaning of function of matrices. So let us say if A is some diagonal matrix, then B, of course, BFA is also diagonal. Now this assumption is based on the fact there is a nicely behaving function. So to check that, you can take any polynomial. For polynomial it is very easy. Polynomial, it is if the polynomial structure is 1 plus x square, sorry, a plus a square plus a cube, something like c1 c2 c3 some factor, then this is obviously true. If it is some function cosine x, that is also a polynomial because you can expand cosine x. It is some function of exponential x, that is also a polynomial. So any such nice behaving structures, this is true. Okay. But what if the A is not diagonal? So then how will you obtain the B function? Because then it becomes a little complicated, but we know that you can do some transformation which diagonalizes A, that is basically these U matrices are formed by the eigenvectors of A. So now you can construct a function which is B prime, and that is function of this A prime, and then this B prime can be diagonalized by the same token, which, because now this is diagonal, because this is a diagonal one, B is also diagonal. Now this B diagonal can be undiagonalized by using the opposite transformation, which is this, and so this B is related to A by this. So if you know the diagonalization of A, basically you know any arbitrary function of the of matrix A, even though that is not diagonalized by this equation. So you can check these statements. Again, if you do not understand this statement fully, I will urge you to do a little bit of trial and error and play with some matrix and some, and 2 by 2s are very simple to play with, to convince yourself that is true, and you can look it up in some mathematical physics books such as Riley-Hobson. Okay. So now according to this token, what is this function e to the power a sigma 3? We know that sigma 3 is diagonal. So that means it must be a diagonal form, and that is given by e to the power a e to the power minus a. So that is this functional form, and if you are not convinced with that, you take this e to the power a sigma 3 and expand it, e to the power a sigma 3 e to the power I a sigma 3 e to the power a sigma 3 square by 2 factorial, and so on. Sorry, there is no I, and this so on. And so then you put it back, and then you obtain this result. Okay. So now if I have this arbitrary, now if it is not diagonal, then what to do? Let us say it is not diagonal, some a dot sigma. So then again I can expand this, and then I can represent this in this form. You can check this term by term that this is true, where this sigma is this sigma vector of sigma 1, sigma 2, sigma 3, and a is some unit vector which is given by a cap, is given by a magnitude. Now you can again cross check this relation to be true, such that this thing holds and the magnitude goes inside this sign A. So now these ideas is are very useful to write down this matrix e to the power IH unitary. So in unitary matrix U can be written as this e to the power IH form, because we know this as a theorem that if H is Hermitian, then e to the power IH any scalar is basically a unitary matrix. So that is also something you can check and or proof by yourself, or convince yourself as it by doing a simple trial and error that it is indeed the case. Or you can do it even more simpler way, that unitary matrix has this property U dagger U is this. So if this is used to have the hold this property, you show that this H must be equal to H dagger if U is given by some e to the power IH form, IH some scalar, let us say t. So then this is to show that. So this is a very simple proof, and that will tell you that this is some, that is also an alternative way to say that why you need Hermitian operator, and because you need unitarity to conserve probability, and hermiticity to make these things real eigenvalues, real measurables, but these two are also compatible with each other because one implies the other. Okay, now let me look at an arbitrary time evolution of a state. So, psi t is like e to the power t minus t naught this. So, if I take t naught equal to 0, so that is basically just e to the power I h t psi naught. The differential form, this is the integral form, this is the full range of t to t naught, some finite range, and the differential form is this, which is e to the power I. So, I h bar d psi t is h psi t. So, now we realize for any arbitrary two state system can be represented like this. There could be special cases which where something is 0, something is non-zero, something. But this is the most general possible thing. There is nothing nothing escapes from this description, where this sigma n is basically defined as n dot sigma and the square is 1. So, it means it has eigenvalues plus minus 1. So, that tells me that if I have two matrices which has so, if one matrix is diagonal, you know the eigenvalue of the other matrix is plus minus 1. So, check this also for yourself. This is a very quick check and very simple thing, that it has two possible eigenvalues, which is a naught plus minus a. Okay. So, now that means I can write down the u of this operator. So, the u in the diagonal basis is this, but by this token, by this token, I know how do I know the u in the off diagonal basis. So, to know that I have to multiply it by some v dagger times v, and again cross check for yourself by putting all these things, that if my n cap is some arbitrary thing. So, then my sigma n is this, and the corresponding v that diagonalizes this must be this. So, if that is the case, so first cross check that the v that diagonalizes this sigma n, like v dagger, sorry, v dagger sigma n v that diagonalizes this is of this form, if this sigma n is this, which is just the eigenvalue, you can arrange it, these are just the eigenvalues of this sigma n. Now, using that, find the form of the u operator, which is like this. That is a very small and simple exercise, and then once you know the form of the u operator, and once you know the parameter, then you can calculate anything. You can calculate anything for the most complicated possible Hamiltonian for this system, which is this. Nothing is more complicated than that because that captures all the aspects. So, now if I put an arbitrary psi t, so take an arbitrary psi t naught, which is parameterized by two arbitrary angle alpha and beta, as we have seen this block, this one point on the block sphere, and then I apply this translation operator on this point. So, this point will start moving. So, this thing will be, when you act on this, the E plus will pick up this phase, because these eigenstates they will just pick up a phase, but the total thing will of course not be stationary, because it is not a eigenkette to begin with. So, it will pick up some phase. So, now if I want to measure what is the probability amplitude of this state with its original starting state, which is what is the return, it is like return probability amplitude, that quantity is basically this. So, if I put it in this psi t, so usually you are interested about what will happen if I measure E plus or E minus, then we just get this coefficient, but you could be also interested about what is the return probability, then you will get this quantity. So, then if I take this and square it to find the probability, I will find this. So, this is basically the, so this is a sinusoidal function that tells you what is the probability of it returning to its original state, the first state where it was, and then again it goes sinusoidally and oscillates. So, this result is actually very important, and these results we will see this led to many experiments and many interesting things. So, that is something we will discuss in the part 3 of this lecture, what is the physical significance of this. Okay. So, that is all here. So, this is all purely mathematical description, and in the part 3 we will see the physical meaning of all.